All right, everybody, welcome back to a really special and unique episode of Flip Your Mindset. I am normally your host, Stacey Urich, and typically I have a guest. But today we're going to do a little bit of a swap, and I am so excited about this. I'm going to be the guest today, and our host is going to be Dr. Veronique Mead. And if you listen to the podcast, you're going to know that I've already had an episode in which she was my guest back in the day. And, we have a lot of alignment in our work, and a lot of the work that Veronique does. I have found to be very interesting. One, because it's really this expanded understanding of ACEs and beyond ACEs, but it's this idea that our adverse lived experiences or any of our lived experiences have an impact on us holistically. And we have spoken a lot off site, off of the podcast, about my own lived experiences and the fact that in my lifetime, I've been diagnosed with 3 autoimmune conditions. And I just don't think that that's such a surprise to me based on everything that I've learned. And I work with so many people that come to me with multitude of health conditions, and I'm constantly sending them to Veronique's website because she offers the most amazing resources. So one of the ideas that we had was that I become a guest on my own podcast, and Veronique actually becomes the host, and she asks me the questions that you guys might want to know the answers to about my own lived experiences and how it impacted my overall health. So I'm going to pass the mic to Dr. Veronique Mead.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be back. It was one of those discoveries in our last podcast together that you were diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis at age 48,
Yeah.
I think it was.
Yeah.
And the others as well. And when in our talk behind the scenes, preparing for today, what we want to do today is talk about what I would call a CRILOG, a chronic illness weblog. And so some people have shared their stories as a blog post on my blog, Chronic Illness Trauma Studies. And today we're doing it with you as a podcast, since that's your medium.
Yeah.
And so call me Veronique. And what I would like us to explore today, we're going to explore together with your history some of the, in medicine, still commonly unrecognized risk factors for autoimmune diseases and other chronic illnesses. We're going to talk about ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences. We'll talk a little bit about that, but really, we've really wanted to focus on the missing ACEs, or the invisible ACEs. And we'll talk some of those. And in the end, or somewhere a little later on, I want you to share what it is that worked for you that made such a huge difference for your insights and what the approach was for you, because the approaches are so different for people.
Yeah.
So where would you like to start? Would you like to start with when you were diagnosed, maybe, and what the symptoms were, just as a place to put us all on the
Yeah,
same page?
absolutely. So the diagnosis that I received was actually during COVID. So anybody that was going through any kind of medical challenge during that time knows it was even extra challenging because we were having a very hard time getting even in with doctors unless you were sick. And then they didn't want to see if you were sick. So it was a very confusing time.
Yeah.
And what I'll share is that the actual diagnosis was something known as seronegative, SERO, negative rheumatoid arthritis. And what I was told by the rheumatologist is that all of my markers showed this extreme inflammation in my body. And all of the inflammation that I had was so unique and specific to the type of pain that somebody with rheumatoid arthritis has. And the only marker I didn't have was the rheumatoid marker. But my C reactive protein was off the charts. All of these things were off whack. The only one I didn't have was the RA marker, but I guess for her it was SERO, is because the serum for the rheumatoid was negative, but everything else was positive. So the pain, the symptoms I had were twofold. One was extreme pain, and the pain was in very, very specific points of my joints. So very specifically on the insides of my elbow, not my whole elbow, only on the insides, very, very tender to the touch. On the insides of the joints of my finger, on the insides of my wrists, insides of my knees, and on my ankles, and the inflammation of my shoulders were very extreme. And the shoulder inflammation was so extreme to the point where I ended up with micro tears in my
Mm.
shoulder, which was incredibly painful. So I had all of this extreme pain happening, where I would wake up crying because I would say to my husband, I haven't even gotten out of bed yet. And I feel like I've pitched 9 innings of a baseball game. Like it just was constant. And then coupled with that was this extreme fatigue.
Mm.
And the only way that I could explain this, because people will see it as you just being very tired. And what I said to my husband is, I'm not tired. I feel like I'm coming out of anesthesia. Like, this
Mm.
is not tiredness. This is this level of fatigue where I don't even feel like I can lift my arm. Like, I can't get up off the couch. And I said, imagine if you have a grape and your grape is like a really healthy cell and it's full of energy, and all of my cells feel like they're depleted like a raisin.
And I want to pause for a second here because for some people whose primary symptom is fatigue, like mine, it can be very difficult. And you just gave really specific examples of what it feels like and how that is different from like a normal tiredness. This is
Yeah,
really
this was not
extreme.
tired. This was, I don't have the energy to stand. Like, because I did, it was the energy depletion. That's what it was. And I kept saying to him, if your cells are filled with energy and they're full, imagine the grape. And we know that a raisin is a depleted grape. So I feel like all of my cells are like raisins right now. Like, I don't have the energy to talk, to sit up. That's, to me, it was very, very different from being tired.
It is. It's very different. It's very different. And when you say coming out of anesthesia, since the theme that I really want to bring in is the role of trauma, that may suggest some component of freeze. What
Yeah,
we know in the trauma field in the polyvagal theory is a dorsal vagal state. Maybe that's what
could
was
be.
your experience when you think of anesthesia.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So, how long was it for you to get the diagnosis?
Well, again, we were in COVID time, so it was very hard
Yes.
to get in with the doctor. And unfortunately, and this is an interesting story, I tried going through the path that we should go through, quote unquote. So I knew something was wrong. And
Hmm.
so I tried getting in with my, this is really funny. I tried getting in with my physician, my general practitioner, and it was, right, this was maybe August of 2020. So we're within the first 4 or 5 months of COVID. And I go in and she says, tell me why you're here. And I start giving her my symptoms of, and I start with chronic fatigue and this extreme fatigue. And she immediately kicks me out of the office and telling me it sounds like a COVID symptom. I didn't even
Oh,
get a chance to even tell her the pain and all the things. I waited months to get that appointment, and I didn't even get a chance to get through the whole appointment because she literally kicked me out
wow.
of the office.
Wow.
And I tried explaining to her, this is not COVID. Like, there's something wrong.
There's
So
something wrong. Yeah.
there's something
Mhm.
wrong. And so then, I didn't really need a referral within my network to go to a rheumatologist. So I just then made a rheumatology appointment with someone in that same, it's a large practice. And it took me a while to get in with her. And then, of course, there's blood work that needs to be done. And then that takes time. So if I started going, say, in July, August to my physician, I don't think I got the diagnosis from the rheumatologist until like October and November.
Amazingly fast for some people, where it can average take 5 years to get a diagnosis.
Mhm.
Did you have any physical symptoms or did you of redness or swelling or anything that they could see?
So I had this. I did have very strange things happening in my hands. And I'll mention, and I mentioned this earlier, I've been diagnosed with 3 autoimmune conditions, right? So for people that don't know, RA is considered autoimmune.
Yes.
So the first one I had ever been diagnosed with was Raynaud's. And that started when I was 15, 16 years old, but I actually wasn't diagnosed with it until I was in my mid 20s. And so if you know anybody with Raynaud's, it can cause this lack of circulation in your hands and really in your extremities, in your fingers and in your toes. And so it wouldn't be uncommon for me to have white fingertips going growing up, whether it's cold or not. So what I started noticing during this time where I had so much inflammation in my body,
Mhm.
um, I was noticing strips of bruising, looking colors in my fingers. So my fingers weren't turning white. I would show my husband, I'm like, look at this. And I would take pictures of it. It would be like these strips of
Mm.
blue and purple, almost like a bruising. And it was almost as though like everything was so inflamed. I was bruising. It was very strange. And then I would bruise only on the inside
Mm.
of my pinkies. So I had these very, very strange, weird. So if like, for example, if I held my phone like this, the inside of my pinky would bruise from holding my phone. So I had these very strange things. So outside of the fatigue and the pain, I was having discoloration specifically on my fingers, and at times, not all the time, the inflammation in my joints of my elbows just on the inside would be bad enough that it would be discolored and it would be purple like a bruising.
How important was that? And I'm asking take a little time here because for some people, getting diagnosed is such a challenge. Being believed is such a challenge.
Well, that's what I was gonna say. I It was hard to get them to stop and listen. What I've learned, and this is look, we have a great medical system compared to the rest of the world, but there are certain parts of it that are very broken, in my opinion. And the one is this timestamp, right? Like all of these medical facilities have all been purchased up by these very big conglomerate private equity companies, whatever. And it's all down to how many patients can you see in a day. And so I could feel that. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. It's that when we're feeling at our worst, and we have these very strange symptoms. Like I'd never had fatigue like that before. I'd never had pain in my joints like this before. I'd never had bruising in these very strange places like this before. All you really want is for somebody to stop and listen, and like
Yeah,
really listen, not have their
really.
head in a screen, not have their head in a laptop, not be looking at a computer. We want the physician to be looking at us and asking us questions. And I didn't really get that experience. So it was a little frustrating because you could tell it was just kind of a lot of let's see what check boxes you fill, but I didn't really feel like anybody was truly, truly listening and willing to answer my questions.
So how did you get heard?
I'm very loud.
You're very loud, you're persistent, I
I'm
suspect.
very persistent,
You're
and
descriptive, you
yes,
took pictures.
listen, I would come in. I wish I had had your resources.
Mm.
I wish I knew about your resources because they would have been so helpful for me. Um, I would spend a lot of time before my doctor's appointments writing out everything and printing it and bringing it to me. And I would actually email that to them before the appointment. So, this is self advocacy 101.
It
And
is.
in my field of trauma, especially with women, not to say men don't do this, but we've been kind of raised to be this way anyway. We're not great at advocating for ourselves and we're not great at prioritizing our needs, whether it comes to our health or whatever. And so I'm kind of the antithesis of that. So I was going to be heard and I needed it to be clear because I was in a lot of discomfort. I was in a lot of pain. Um, so I think I wasn't going to take anything other than an answer for an answer. Like I wasn't willing to not be heard.
Well, it
But I
sounds like you also got kind of kicked out of that first office when you started with the wrong thing, talking about fatigues,
yeah,
let's say, the wrong thing. That's what all I have. So some of us, that's the only symptom. But so you weren't going to take no the next time. You scheduled with someone else. You looked for a specialist because you had done your own research, I suspect, and had
right.
an idea. So you narrowed it down that way. And then once you were in the office, you were loud. You just were
I just made
persistent.
sure that I was heard.
Yeah.
And I wasn't really willing to leave until I knew I had everything I needed to say. And it's
Yeah.
hard because
Yeah.
again, I was part of a very big practice then, and I think I've learned a lesson for myself is as I've gotten older, I've had other medical issues. I'm now just working with people that are kind of in private practice, which is very, very hard to find because these companies come in and they eat everybody up and make them part of a bigger system. And so when you're in that bigger system, and I've experienced this a lot, there's a lot of kind of like side eyeing, looking at the clock, they're minding their time. And I get it. Like, I don't want my doctor to get in trouble. I understand that they have these things to fulfill, but at the same time, that's the broken part of the system. And I wasn't willing to be like, okay, well, I see your time is up. So I guess my time's up. I was like, no, we're not done. Like, I need to make sure you understand. And
Mhm.
so, I think when we're in this situation, there's two things. Number one, you have the right to advocate for yourself. And even if you're not comfortable advocating for yourself, writing out a piece of paper before you come in and just handing it to the doctor can be a piece of self advocacy. And then also prioritizing your needs over other people's needs. We have a very hard time as trauma survivors doing that. And then layer on the next intersection of that, which is being a woman. We're not very good
Yeah.
at that. And we're allowed to say, I'm not okay. And we're allowed to say, I want an answer. This is the only place I can go for the answer. You don't want me getting the answer on WebMD. You don't want me to get the answer on Google. You want me to get the answer from a professional. I'm here. Make the time for me. So, we feel guilt and shame and we don't like to be a burden. I hear this so much from my clients, we don't want to be intrusive, but if the system doesn't allow for, then you kind of have to be the buck in the system and you have to be the burden because if you don't do it for yourself, no one else is going to do it for you.
Which is actually a lesson in the world of trauma, also as part of our own healing, is taking up our space and sometimes having to push. And so those are all really valuable and what people in a chronic illness situation learn over time. You develop your skills, you learn how to do it, you do better the next time. And so, did your lab results then come back along with your history of the Raynaud's and this new symptoms? Was that enough for a second visit for them to say, oh, your diagnosis is rheumatoid
Correct.
arthritis?
That's exactly right. So I
Okay.
think that they looked at the other diagnoses, they looked at all of the blood work and the lab work. The C-reactive protein I think was a big kicker for them because for people that don't know, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Veronique, but I believe the C-reactive protein is like an inflammation marker, correct?
Yeah.
So, just based on my own research, I think you want it to be like under a 3, right? I think like the baseline is 3 and under is quote unquote normal. Anything above a 3 is indication of inflammation. I think when
Being quite severe,
yeah,
actually.
so when I
Mhm.
went, I was like, they were testing my blood quite a bit. I was like 8, 9, 10. So
Really high.
which, I think people who have medical issues, they kind of love this part in the sense where you're like, you see, like I am in
Yeah.
pain. Like I'm not
Something
lying.
concrete, which not everyone has. You had some labs that were
I had
abnormal.
concrete labs that I was like, I'm in so much pain. And the thing is that fatigue I knew in my head was potentially also my body's spending so much time fighting this pain. this constant chronic pain. So when you hear things like chronic pain and chronic fatigue, and I knew a lot about ACEs. I shouldn't say I knew enough. I knew
Mm.
about ACEs already. I had already been studying it for many years, and I knew my ACEs score. And so that was a part of the conversation. And, if I could spend my whole life doing what you're doing, Veronique, and just trying to infiltrate, the medical system and show up at doctor's offices like a pharmaceutical rep does and inform our medical system on what trauma is, um, it would be really beneficial to the patient. So, when I was diagnosed with the seronegative rheumatoid arthritis, her immediate offering was steroids. And I also knew that steroids were not, just intuitively, I knew this is not actually what I need.
Mm.
Um, there was actually a part of me, and I don't really talk about this very often. When I got diagnosed, there was a part of me, and people who know I love parts work, so I'll use this language. There was a part of me that was like, yes, like I have a diagnosis. I'm not crazy. See, it is that bad.
And it's real.
And it's real.
Mhm.
And my pain is real and my fatigue is real. And by the way, and this is, I'm just thinking of this now as we're talking, part of my challenge growing up um, was not being heard. And part of
Yes.
my challenge growing up was not being believed.
Yes.
And so I think a lot of people can relate to that. When right? Like when we are desperately growing up, seeing things and saying things and knowing our truth and trusting our own knowing. And I'm going to use the term loosely, being gaslit for better purposes to say like you don't really know what you're talking about.
By the parents or your primary caregivers, and then having that
Correct.
reenacted
That's right.
in the
And I
medical system. Yeah.
And I think a
Yeah.
lot of people struggle with that because I think that that speaks to a lot of people. So there was a part of me that was very grateful that I felt heard enough and believed enough by way of, thank God, my blood work for them to
Yeah.
see it. But there was also another part of me. And that part of me was bigger and bolder and louder that was saying, you know what this is. And what that was for me was I knew because I could feel it. I could feel the inflammation in my body. And really, if you think about it, these other two autoimmune conditions I've been diagnosed with are very inflammatory, right? So if you talk about Raynaud's, you're talking about a constriction of your blood vessels, right? It's not swollen, but like they're not working, they're constricted. You're not getting any um, energy to your fingertips and they're turning blue and white. And I have it happen to me pretty much on the daily still. The other diagnosis I had was endometriosis, which anybody that's listening to this, if you've ever suffered from endometriosis, my heart goes out to you because that is a level of pain and discomfort that is so debilitating. And that was another situation where I was gaslit by medical professionals for a long time. And I was told lies by doctors that it was not endometriosis. Then to find out later, there was no way that they could tell me that unless I had the laparoscopy, but I didn't know what I didn't know. So
That's
I
right.
believed the doctor because it was a doctor. And
Yeah.
then, it took me 13 years of pain. I suffered from endometriosis for 13 years until somebody actually was like, "What do you mean? You have to have a laparoscopy to be told you have it or don't have it." So I had already been through this experience where I wasn't being heard both growing up and in the medical industry, right? So this other part of me that was like, I don't think so, was this part of me that was like, I know I've now been diagnosed with a third very inflammatory condition. And if I know enough about ACEs, I know that the higher your ACEs score, and it doesn't have to be that high, by the way,
That's correct.
it can
Yeah.
have a massive impact on your immune system and it can have a massive impact on your joints, your body, your muscle, your bones, your fiber, just all parts of you. So I said to the doctor, listen, what do you know about ACEs? And
Great question.
that was my question to my doctor
Yeah, yeah.
because she's offering me this steroid. And I said, I'm
Mhm.
not feeling that because, and I said to her, that feels like a band aid on a bullet wound for me.
And that's a really big term, and you mentioned it in our last podcast, a
Yeah, I feel
Band-Aid, bullet wound when you're working with what actually has underpinnings of trauma that date back decades.
right. And so I
Yeah.
just said to her, I'm not willing to buy the narrative that this just shows up
Out of the
because
blue.
there's nobody else in my family that has had been diagnosed with any any chronic illnesses or chronic conditions. None. And so I'm like, this doesn't make sense to me. Nobody else has had autoimmune issues except for me. So I said, my ACEs score, depending, and this was before I even saw yours, which is very extensive, but general ACEs of 10 questions or so. Sometimes they vary, the questions, was between a 4 and a 5. And I had looked on my phone to see while she was doing whatever how ACEs correlate to rheumatoid arthritis. And it said, and you'll know this better than me, any score of 2 or above on the ACEs scale was like a 40% likelihood. And then anything above that was another 20%.
And actually, so just for any listeners who aren't
Yeah,
familiar with ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences, there are 10 that are commonly in the survey if you take the ACEs survey. And when you say you're referring to that on my website being extensive, there are other surveys I've had, the missing ACEs surveys that are really extensive with like 100 different check boxes to look at.
right.
Because for many people, they haven't experienced some or many of those 10 ACEs, which are physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, emotional or physical neglect, having parents, losing a parent through divorce or separation. And now, when you talk to, say, Dr. Vincent Felitti, one of the co founders of ACEs, they'll expand that. Really, if you lose a parent for any reason, including death of a parent, which wasn't really part of that initial way we talked about it,
Right.
having a parent with a mental illness, which could be something as simple as depression, which can have a huge impact on the parent, but also on the child. A parent with a history of substance abuse who's been using alcohol or drugs, because those things really impact A, how they're feeling it and working with themselves, and B, how they're interacting and connecting and attuning with you as the child. So we're up to 8. And the other ACEs are if there's a parent who went to jail or someone in the family system, in the household, who was ever spent time in jail. Again, partly because of all the indicators of what that can mean if you lose a parent through having to leave for something
Right.
like incarceration. And then domestic violence. And it's been oriented in the ACEs of towards the mother, but domestic
Yes.
violence towards the any either parent or to anyone in the household. Again, that's not part of the ACE. That's why I have the missing ACEs, because that would be a component of witnessing violence
Mhm.
and trauma, which
Mhm.
impacts us just as much. So that's the 10 ACEs. And then you mentioned 40%. There's a study by Shanta Dubé and her team that looked at the original data of 17,000 people from a middle class background at Kaiser Permanente.
Mhm.
Those adults who were in that study primarily white and middle class, 70%, you had a 70% chance of having ever been hospitalized for an autoimmune disease with an ACE score of 2 or more. 2 or more could mean that your parents separated or divorced, and maybe your mom had postpartum depression.
Right.
So it doesn't matter which ACE you've experienced.
That's exactly right. Right.
And so then you can add a 20% for each additional ACE, increases the chances. So there's a lot we could say about ACEs, but people are more familiar with ACEs. What I'd like to do here, Stacey, is shift towards these missing ACEs, like what you
I
just
love that.
named, not being seen, not being heard. What When you started putting this together, and part of what you're talking to your doctor is about is, okay, have you heard of ACEs? So let's actually complete that, and then let's jump into this other
Yeah.
history.
So I knew I had already been working towards at that point my certifications in trauma and being a trauma practitioner, but I had been studying ACEs for years outside of that. So I knew enough to know, I think that this is actually residual inflammation in my body from unresolved things that I thought I've resolved that I haven't fully resolved, that I experienced, that I witnessed, that I felt, what have you. So I said to her, why don't we just pump the brakes on the steroids and let me just approach this from the way I would like to approach it, which I wanted to do very deep therapeutic type of acupuncture with a trauma trained acupuncturist.
Mm.
And then I said, give me 3 months. And so that's what we did. And I was in acupuncture 2 times a week, maybe more, for about 3 months. And what was beautiful was that I had some great emotional epiphanies on the table. I have a great acupuncturist. Sometimes I feel like I'm levitating. She gets me. And what I can say is, for those of you that know the window of tolerance, because you've listened to my podcast, she widens my window of tolerance to such an extreme. I feel like I'm just floating. I'm so grounded. Um, all my parts are at bay and asleep, and I can just be, and my body's not tense, and my body's just so fluid and flexible, and I can feel it. So I was doing this with her and getting my body into that state multiple times a week. And I had a lot of epiphanies. I when you're not so armored up, you can see things clearer, you can think about things, and it would be emotional.
Mm.
When I went back and got my blood tested, my C-reactive protein was actually higher than it had ever been, which would have indicated more inflammation. But the issue at that point was I was no longer feeling that level of pain, and my fatigue was getting better.
So
And
your symptoms were improving, and I think you said your CRP went from an 8 or a 9 to like a 10.8 or
correct.
something.
And
Mhm.
so the blessing with that doctor was she did say, let's treat the patient, not the number, which I
Nice.
really appreciated. And I just said, I feel better. And the likelihood that my numbers are higher right now is just because everything's coming to the surface, but it's not impacting me the same way. So let's just watch and wait. And that's really what I did. And the next time I did this for about a year. And when I went back, my C reactive protein was at a 2.7.
Wow. So concrete evidence
Concrete
on top of
evidence.
symptom reduction with a year of treatment. And I just want to name the ACEs piece. CRP levels are actually associated with ACEs. And one of the things that we can see is someone may have an elevated CRP for some time before the onset of a chronic illness. Doesn't mean you'll develop one, but it can show up for years beforehand,
Right.
as can a rheumatoid factor or other indicators for some of those who have a positive. So that CRP actually ended up going way, way, way down.
Way down.
And what was in the last podcast, I was so struck by your awareness of I actually have a worse CRP because there's more emotional stuff that's been coming up, which is a huge perspective to be able to have to help us when we're working through things, to not see it as failing, but actually see it as part of the process.
100%.
And you had some epiphanies. Would you share some of those with us?
Yeah. I mean, this is, people will always say they'll never forget where they were when they recognized X, right? So there was a moment where I was on the table, I was on that acupuncture table a lot. And one of the things that I really wanted in all of my sessions was cupping. I really like cupping,
Mm.
it's always worked very well with me. So after an acupuncture session, we would always spend time cupping my back. and my back would be covered from the base of my neck all the way to my sacrum, all the way to the bottom of my butt, just covered in, cups for cupping. And my acupuncturist used cups in the shape of a heart. So, if you've ever had cupping done, and I've had lots of different kinds of cupping, sometimes they'll put it on and they'll move it around, which can be very painful. But these were just kind of stagnant. She would just cover my whole back and allow these toxins to be pulled out, which is why I wanted it. And when you first get it, it's very, very tight. And one of the things I had learned in all my years of doing the work that I've been doing, because I've been in therapy since I was 15 years old. And at that point, I'm 48. So, you're talking over 30 years on and off.
Was it trauma therapy or anything oriented towards trauma work?
Honey, I started in 1986. There was no such thing as trauma therapy.
Exactly. This is
So
just
never,
helpful. So you weren't
never,
actually getting to the trauma part.
never,
So that's helpful
never.
to know. Yeah, 30 years of
I
therapy, but it
I
wasn't
never worked with a
okay.
trauma specialist until I got trained as a trauma specialist. 'Cause I didn't even know that therapists weren't inherently trained in trauma,
We
which
don't
is a whole
realize
other
that.
conversation. But
Yeah. Back to
the
cupping
epiphany,
your table. Yeah, the
so
epiphany.
back to the epiphany. So I'm very uncomfortable. And one of the things I had learned through all these years of therapy and what have you was never create a story where it doesn't exist, and sit with discomfort without labeling it. So I had this great discomfort on my back because my whole back was covered in these cups and everything's kind of like pulling up into the cup, right? So it's very, very tight. And I kept thinking to myself, don't label this. Don't say it's painful. Don't say this is uncomfortable. It just is. And just ease into it and relax in it. And at some point, you'll just stop feeling this. And it's true. Like if you do that, at some point, it just is. If you don't give it a label, it doesn't become more extreme, right? Like, so I was doing that. So I had gotten myself into this very relaxed state. So my acupuncturist has this ability to get me almost into this hypnotic state. And I can only say that 'cause I do hypnosis and I know what that feels like. And I heard a whisper. And the whisper was, "You were never alone. I was always with you." And what that meant to me was so huge because what I didn't really understand until that moment was that one of the things that was so traumatic for me in my childhood was the isolation and feeling alone in the experience. I'd never really been able to put language to that. And I heard it. And what it meant for me is my body's way of saying, I took this all on for you. I just can't, I'm broken from it. I can't take it on anymore. I can't brace myself anymore. And I knew it. I knew exactly what was happening. So I heard, "You were never alone. I was always there." It was this a huge awakening for me.
I'm
I
having
started
goosebumps at the moment just
I
hearing
started
that.
crying, and in my head I just kept saying back to myself and my parts, "Thank you. I got it. Thank you. I got it, and I'm going to give back to you now." And that was my way of saying, "I understand I wasn't alone." Even though I really never had the epiphany or like that enlightenedness to understand that that was such a big thing for me. But it when I look back, it has had this red thread through my whole life.
The
I am
feeling alone.
hyper independent
Yeah.
because I
Independent.
felt like I nobody's listening. How do I make this better for myself?
Yeah.
I feel so alone in this experience. So for me to hear that from nowhere, it was the turning point for me in my healing. I knew why my body was jacked up. I knew that my body had taken that all on for me. And now this was just my way of saying, "Okay, I'm doing the right thing. I'm healing you now." And it was
You
just me,
connected with yourself in a way from this sense of no longer feeling so
right,
alone.
right. It was amazing. It was probably very similar to some of the experiences my clients have when they do hypnosis with me. It's like you gain this great clarity and
Yeah.
this great understanding about something that you cannot unsee.
Yeah.
And that's what I got by giving that gift to myself of all that acupuncture and being still. You have to be still in
Mhm.
acupuncture, being still and just being with yourself.
It's kind of like there are all different ways of thinking about this. One way could be the adult self able to be with
Oh,
all these parts that were, as a child, terrified. Being alone is terrifying for a child, feeling, even if there are people around, if they're not attuning or seeing or believing, it doesn't matter. You don't feel the connection. And for a child that is dependent on the adult caregivers,
that's right.
it's the equivalent really of kind of feeling like you're at complete risk of death.
Yeah. I mean, this is what people don't understand about emotional neglect.
Yes.
So, when we go to Maslow's hierarchy, which I present to my clients all the time, we have basic needs. These are not wants, these are basic needs that we need to have in our human experience. The physiological stuff everybody gets: food, water, air,
A
clean
roof over your head,
roof over your
being
head, all the
warm. Yeah.
things, right?
Yeah.
The second is safety and security. I know in this space that I'm being forced to be in, that I'm going to have safety and security. And then right in with that and right above it, but I see them as very intertwined, is the love and belonging,
What
right? Love and belonging,
love and
meaning
belonging. Yeah.
love and belonging, meaning there's nothing you have to do
Yeah.
to gain my love and acceptance. You don't have to
Huge,
shapeshift.
huge,
It's
huge.
everything. And that's the missing piece. And that's what I see the majority of in my practice. It's not to say I don't see the others, because I certainly do. But we are hardwired for connection as human beings.
Yes. And this, can I
Yes,
put a
yes,
little piece?
please.
From the trauma perspective, this is the social nervous system component that's at the
Mm,
top of the pyramid that keeps us safe. If we feel connected, if we have others around us who are protected, if we're the wildebeest that all turn facing the threat from the outside and the babies and the calves are in the middle and are protected, the connection is really the king or the queen of sense of safety.
that's right.
And then if we don't have that, there's the fight, the flight, the freeze, the survival response, the efforting that is required, including in a household with both parents where there is no poverty or where you're gotten the basics taken care of. And that's where ACEs, if a parent is not attuning, if they're abusive, if they're taking a lot of some kind of drugs or alcohol to self soothe, that's speaking to their own trauma, that's limiting what's available. So that's part of how the ACEs affect the social nervous system.
Right.
And the missing ACEs speaks to all this other invisible stuff that's going on that isn't seen, that we don't think about, that doctors
I
aren't
call it
trained
the
about.
mist. I call that those unseen aces, the mist of dysfunction.
MIST, mist.
MIST. It's like
Mhm.
it's this effervescent mist. If you go outside and it's misty outside where it's not raining, but even though you go outside, you're like covered in water because there's a mist in the air. It's like you don't see the raindrops, you don't see lightning, you don't see thunder, which we might see as like quote unquote trauma.
Right.
But yet there's this mist surrounding me of dysfunction that's chronic and pervasive that I just can't put my finger on it because it's not overt, so covert, but it's actually the norm for us.
As a child, when it's all
Yes.
you know,
You
how
don't know any
many
different.
of us say we had a great childhood? And there are many great things. And that's, we could talk about positive ACEs, the
Of
things that
course.
actually kind of help. Or maybe we could just jump to that now from the mist is you had some experiences that were that we think about not just the adverse experience, but the positive ones that can make a really huge difference in how it is that you got as far as you did before you even started with the RA, for example.
Right. So I call these resilience factors, right?
Mhm.
So
Mm.
if we think of it from a visual standpoint, if we think of chronic pervasive stressors as this myth of dysfunction, I see the resilience factors of like rays of light, right? As like rays of sunshine, where you just feel held and warm and safe. And so I think, and it's interesting because you have your own scoring, I have my own survey I've been developing for years that's about to come out. And the value of the resilience factors are they're kind of like the word that I'm looking for. Not the antithesis, but they kind of like balance out, quote unquote. So you could think of a resilience factor as anyone you could go to be able to talk about it. So for me, the biggest resilience factor was my grandparents, no question about it. They listened, they believed, they held space in a non judgmental, loving way. And that's what we need. We need one person, right? And I did have more than one person. I had a good friend's parent. I forced myself. You wonder how I got diagnosed at the doctor's office. I had a 2-year campaign within my home to get me into therapy that I probably started around 13, 14. Now remember, I was born in 1971. So that would have been early to mid 80s. I'm campaigning for this. People didn't go to therapy then, and certainly you weren't sending your kid. And so I knew enough, I don't know how, by the grace of whatever you believe in, that I even knew what therapy was or even how to find a therapist. There's no internet. All we had was yellow pages. I have no idea how I found this woman, but I found her on my own. And I did have to pay for half of my session. It was $7. This was every barrier they tried to put in front of me to not go. And she
Yeah.
was a saving grace for me
Yeah.
because she believed me, she listened. Um,
And this is working the trauma piece without calling it that, because it's the
100%.
connection that creates a sense of safety and
That's
helps
right.
validate your own sense of self.
That's right.
And that you use the word balance and resilience. I think of it as these resources, they make they make a big difference. And
They do.
trauma is, for many, many people, it's the fact that there were too many adverse events in the face of too little support
Support.
or
Right.
resources. And so that's where that balance is. And sometimes this was just too big, but often it could even be that it was too much too fast.
Right.
And so that's part of the process. Not everybody who experiences events we would consider as traumatic, an accident, for example, develops trauma symptoms.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I would say some of the other resilience factors are like, you know, after school activities. you
Yes.
know, theater, band, sports. If you have a great mentor as a teacher or a coach or a counselor, community centers are so important when they're run in a well-run way. These can be places where we go, where we feel safe, we feel seen, we feel secure. Libraries, museums,
Yes.
all of these
Yeah.
things can be a place where someone can either lose themselves in the reality of what is, or they can just be with others where they do feel that support and that love and belonging. And so the resilience factors are very important. And for me, I had good friends, I had my grandparents. I had a great therapist. I had a couple of, mom friends, like friends of my mom, of moms of my friends that were very kind and loving and supportive. And, it just, those were the things that really helped me feel seen. And that's really what it comes down to. I can't count
Yeah.
how many people I work with that just the challenge is that they didn't feel seen. And you can fill in
Yeah.
that blank, seen as worthy, seen as valuable, seen as important, seen as significant, as a member of the family. I had one client once tell me that they actually questioned their whole lives if maybe they were even adopted because they just never felt like they belonged or fit into their family system.
Exactly. And I call these adverse childhood relationship experiences. These
Yes.
acres are missing aces. This is what we think of as associated with complex PTSD, because as you've mentioned, it's day in, day out kind of exposure all the time because it's within the interactions we have in our family systems. Or if we didn't have a family, with the foster care, with the adoptive parents, with not a whole lot of interactions, whatever it can be. And some people who had taken my survey, the first version of it, I ended up doubling the number of questions based on people's input because there isn't something really detailed out there. But people who have been through it gave me great examples, like feeling as though they slipped through the cracks,
100%.
or feeling as though you had to walk on eggshells when you were
Yes.
around your family system, or feeling like it was better to have no feelings because that was safer, certainly not having anger, or that it was better to be quiet, which can also be a thing that puts us in a direction of freeze.
Right.
Yeah,
And these are all brilliant adaptations. I mean, people have
they
to
are.
remember that.
Yes.
And I think my clients think I'm crazy when I say this, but I'm like, before you're anything, you are a mammal and we are animals, highly intelligent, highly involved, but we have natural animal instincts and we must adapt. So I always say we assess, we address, and we adapt, right? So we're constantly assessing our environment. We learn, especially if we grew up in a midst of dysfunction, to scan and be hyper aware
Yeah.
of our surroundings. And then we start to address, okay, what do I want to do with that piece of information? And then we adapt. And we must adapt. If you meet an animal in the wild, it's adapting all the time. But what we don't understand is that our adaptations look like people pleasing, no boundary setting, rage, anger, OCD, any kind of ism you can think about, right? Any kind of addiction, um, self sabotage, inner critic. Like I was listening to a podcast the other day, and the guy was telling a story. It was a podcast about trauma. It was with Dr. Peter Attia, and he was interviewing somebody from the center called the Bridge out in, I think it's Tennessee or Kentucky, and it's a trauma rehab, if you will. And he was talking about the story. It was very powerful, of a young 4-year-old boy whose parents were in their 30s, and there was a lot of domestic violence in the house. And the dad was in a rage when he came home. And so this boy had learned, this is the adaptation, to stay small, stay quiet, stay unseen, and just stay in my room with the door shut and just play by myself. This was a survival tactic. But he heard his mother say, "You're hurting me. I think you're going to break my arm." And so this young 4-year-old, 5-year-old boy decided he needed to take action. So if anybody understands polyvagal theory or anything in that space, it's like when we start to move into that sympathetic state and that fight or flight state, it's this I must take an action. I need to do something in the face of this threat. Even animals do this. So this boy so brilliantly decided he would peek his head out the door and see what was happening. And as he was doing so, he passed the bathroom and he went into the bathroom and pretended like he was throwing up. And the mom goes, "You see, now he's getting sick." And so it stopped what was happening,
Wow.
and it stopped what it was happening, right? They checked on him. He was like, "Oh, I thought I was going to throw up. I didn't throw up." But he stopped it. And what this guy was saying is, I think he was referring to himself. trauma therapist,
Yeah.
saying, and then that little boy learned how to manipulate and control outcomes. It's not conscious, but it's like super cause and effect. And he said, and I'll say it was the most brilliant thing. So when we talk about brilliant adaptations,
Mhm.
these are survival skills. Because if you know someone else has been getting hit and someone else is being hurt in your household, what would make you think that you're not next? Right? So we have to adapt in survival of whatever we see. If what we're experiencing is not violent at all, but someone's coming home and say dad or mom have their own unresolved traumas and they get overwhelmed by life, and maybe dad comes home every day and cracks a beer and sits in the lazy boy and wants to watch TV, and the general unspoken rule in the house is don't bother dad, it feels like neglect to that kid. And I've had plenty of people under hypnosis saying one of the scenes that comes up for them is they're sitting in a room with their parent, but they're not allowed to engage with the parent because that's the unspoken rule. Just leave them alone or leave her alone. The thought process of the child is, but if I was enough, they would want to spend time with me. They don't have the
Mhm.
insight to say dad has his own stuff or maybe he's stressed about the money. We don't have that reference point. We make it about us. And so now all of a sudden it's I'm not important. I'm not valuable. I'm not significant because if I was, no matter what was going on, dad would want to spend time with me.
Yeah. And so there's these internalized belief systems that we develop as a result of that.
And then we learn to adapt.
And the adaptation part is the perspective I've developed and some of the research and some of the trauma training of a trauma perspective of chronic illness being a not just an adaptation, maybe that's the general view, like what you're saying. It's absolutely about a intelligent adaptive response that allowed us to survive long enough so then we can later deal with the other stuff. Underneath that layer, I would think of it as there's a lot of perspectives suggesting that a chronic illness is a survival response that's gotten stuck in one of these states, whether it's fight or flight or freeze, very likely a combination of all those. And if you can reduce or shift that perspective that's gotten stuck in the brain,
Right.
so it knows that it's actually safe in this present moment, so that those can begin to turn off.
This is where the hypnosis work comes in really, really big, right? So I'm trained by Marissa Peer in a therapeutic model known as rapid transformational therapy. And, within that model, there are a lot of components, but one of the components is parts work. And so sometimes, not all the time, if somebody's coming to me with chronic pain, chronic illness, chronic what have you, and I'm actually able, and I know it sounds a little strange for people that don't understand parts work, but if I'm able to dialogue directly with the part of them that is fill in the blank, the MS, the chronic fatigue, the lupus, the Sjogren's, the Hashimoto's, you name it, I really can't think of a time where the part doesn't just offer up that they think that the role in that person's life is to keep them safe, seen, or protected.
The MS or the chronic illness, whatever it
All
is,
of it.
that's the job of it.
And
Mhm.
sometimes it's to prioritize, which I don't get all the time, but I've gotten it. And what that really ends up looking at, because we peeled back the layers, we're in that space for like an hour, right? So I'm asking a lot of questions. What's your role in this person's life? What's your function? What's your purpose? What's your intention in so and so's life? And if it is prioritized, which most of the time it's a protective measure, but the prioritize is it gets me seen, it gets me the attention I never
Mm.
had before, or sometimes it even gives a bond So, for example, if another family member was sick, or maybe if mom always suffered from migraines and now all of a sudden I have migraines, and there's this
Mm.
idea of maybe it's genetically inherited, but there's also this other concept of, well, maybe this is a way to relate, right? So it can be very deep, deep in the subconscious. And this is where doing some parts work at the hypnosis level of that theta brainwave state allows for the part to speak freely. And what's so beautiful for the client is they gain great clarity because they're experiencing
Mhm.
this, they're hearing this, they're witnessing it from themselves, and it gives them a different relationship with the part that is not well. And what people need to understand is, and this is what I'd love for you to be able to talk more about, is it does change your chemistry. It does change
Yes.
you at this DNA level. So people say, well, that's just ridiculous because the blood work shows, or my DNA shows, or, the labs show the concrete, like it did for me. This is it. So I don't want to hear your talk about parts work, or I don't want to hear your talk about trauma because, look, this is my body. But trauma and these lived experiences and ACEs, we'll use that term, change your body's immune system. They change your ability to handle stress. They change your cortisol levels, your adrenaline levels. All of these things get impacted that can change the way your body functions. Is that fair to say?
It is, and the research supports this. In the somatic trauma work that I've done, when we're working with what is the information coming from your own body, your sensations, your impulses, as the approach that I've used, it's something that no one can make up and no one else knows. It's only your own system that knows because of what it went through. And the theory in my own training was somatic experiencing in SE. In that approach, the theory is that if the body has, let's say, a trapped fight response, maybe it wasn't safe to be angry, it wasn't safe to set a boundary and say no when you were angry. And if we access that, the body feels the impulse in a therapy session, there's some way in which you say no. Maybe it's in the present. No, I do not want that job. I am not taking it. I am not going to do that. Or the simple ones. No, I'm not going to that holiday meal. But often the underlying one was in a situation of relative threat or perceived threat.
Mm.
Um, when we can feel that no and actually, whether it's enacted in a subtle way in the present moment or feel that, there's a shift that happens in the body. There may be tingling, there may be heat, there
Right.
may actually be a movement. It actually sends a signal to the nervous system that it would have done if it could have at the time, that animals do in the wild. And it conveys the message that that threat is over. You defended yourself, you survived that, it's over. And so, from the SE perspective, that's how it shifts.
We call that closing the loop.
That's the closing the loop.
That's the, and I do that a lot in the hypnosis. It's like, let's go back to that moment and let's close the loop, right?
Exactly.
Because
Yeah.
when you're in that moment, and I'll say, well, what did you do as a 6-year-old or a 5-year-old in the scene where, you're not feeling seen, heard, understood, or whatever the situation is that they're sharing with me? The way I help them close the loop is, what feeling did you have that you didn't have the ability to process in that moment?
It's often a feeling.
And
Mhm.
what do you need now in
Mhm.
order to process it? And usually I tell them to imagine, as we're going through this journey, that they're almost like in a scene of the Christmas Carol where they're like Scrooge and they're watching from the side. You know how Scrooge is
Yeah.
watching from the side in the past, present, future? Like,
Mhm.
imagine you're like that, but you're watching this younger version of yourself through wherever we're at, a window or a doorway or whatever. And I want your younger self to turn and see your older self. And I want your younger self to acknowledge that 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 is your older self, that that is your current self, and your current self recognizes who the younger one is. And I just want to know, would it be okay to get closer? Is it okay for your older self to enter the space, or do you want to walk over to your older self? But somehow I get them to visualize the older version of them and this younger version of them coming closer
And connecting
and
in some
connecting. And
way.
then I say, what is it that you need? I needed a hug. I needed to be told I was okay. I just need to cry. I need whatever. And then I say, what's your comfort level with getting it from this version of yourself? And I create that moment for them so they can be in it. And then I say to the older, what do you think this younger one needs to hear? And so we start doing this reparenting and this inner child work like in that moment.
Yeah.
And as before we've even gotten to that space, I've asked them to create a safe space, a place that they just always feel like they can just be. Some people, it's the woods in a cabin, or it's the beach, or it's the field, or someplace in nature where they just can be relaxed and have fun and be playful. And then I imagine them bringing that younger version to this place. And then they do something playful together. And then if we do, say, two or three other scenes, whatever age the child is in these other scenes, we bring that other one to. So now all of a sudden we might have like two or three younger versions, and we ask them to play together and all these things. But this is part of closing the loop. It's we experienced it now in the way it needed to be experienced in the moment. And now they can just be. And they don't have to carry that burden with them anymore.
Time is not a linear thing in our system.
Right.
And so, from the research point of view, Rachel Yehuda, who's a major researcher in the field of trauma, has a study where veterans who recovered from PTSD had a reversal of an epigenetic pattern
Mm.
after the kind of therapy that they used in their study. And that reversal is also seen in mice that were with a mother rat. Actually, it was rats that was less nurturing, less attentive, less grooming and licking, which are maternal behaviors. Those rats that had less maternal behavior exposures have one particular epigenetic pattern for more sensitivity to stress. But when they're cross-fostered, if they're moved into a more nurturing maternal experience in a certain time frame, that epigenetic pattern can reverse and the stress response can reverse. So there's different times of our lives, and these veterans with PTSD in Rachel's Yehuda study were adults. So there's science, there's experience, there's lived experience, there's many different approaches, and it's by going like you did with what you were drawn to. So I'm wondering if we might shift gears and just say, where are you now with your symptoms? How long is this
Such a
with
good
your
question.
acupuncture? Yeah.
So we'll start backwards from when I got all these different things. So with the rheumatoid arthritis, we'll start there. I can honestly say that acupuncture was everything for me. I no longer have any chronic fatigue. After that, the chronic fatigue was gone, completely gone. I've never really experienced that again. There will be times, because anyone that's ever had this kind of autoimmune condition knows it's such a strange, weird pain. I really cannot describe the pain that is part of rheumatoid arthritis, but there will be time to time where I feel it on the inside of my elbows, but then I'm able to stop and assess
Mm.
what's going on and around me, that there's a part of me that's coming up that's
Triggered?
creating inflammation in my system for me
Mm-hmm.
to stop me
Mm.
from doing whatever action I would normally take. And then I just get curious and I'm just able to kind of work from that. So, what I always love to say when I'm working with people, and this is what I do for myself, is it's never about the elimination of anything, anxiety, pain, whatever. It's we're looking for the decrease of frequency, duration, and intensity. So for me, very infrequently comes up now. But when it does, the duration is not that long. and the intensity is not nearly as, it's a fraction. So if it
Mhm.
would last for days, it might last for an hour or a
Yes.
couple of hours. You know what I'm saying? Like I recognize it quicker. I understand what I'm dealing with. And then I start doing that inner healing with myself. And then all of that starts to dissipate at a much greater rate than it would if I hadn't been doing the work.
And I'll just throw in same thing on my end, in that it's an opportunity to look for triggers,
Yeah.
something that reminds the system of what happened in the past or that's eliciting an old pattern. And it maybe it's the same pattern you've worked on before, and you're much more able to recognize it, identify what it's linked to, and work through whatever it's stimulating now.
And I think it's important for people, people are linear. So they know that I don't like the term broken, but they might say, I'm broken and I want you to fix me. I mean, I hear this all the time and we get rid of that language very quickly. But what people need to understand is if they have done really well for a long period of time and then all of a sudden this old friend comes back, whether it's the pain or the ruminating thoughts or the anxiety, whatever it is, it doesn't mean that there's a problem or that something is
Mm,
broken or
mm,
that nothing worked or we're right back to where we started. This is a process. Everything's fluid, everything's flexible. Nothing goes from here to here. It's this windy road. And so, yeah, there are going to be times that these things come up. We get to get curious about why it's coming up.
How about a final piece on, is there anything you want to share? I know you mentioned you were working on a book.
I am working on a book. So, I'm launching a course October 1st, 2025, called The Calm Code.
Mm.
And the course is an 8-week live course that is designed to give people a better understanding of how their lived experiences have impacted them. And it's specifically around anxiety. So it's about healing anxiety from within and really getting again to that root versus the band-aid on the bullet wound, getting to the root of what are the things that I experienced in my life that caused me to adapt in such a way that I have this fight or flight in my system so often that it's stopping me in my tracks. And with that course has come a book. So the book will likely come out in January. It is going to be a two-part book. The first part of the book is my lived experience. And the reason why I put that in there is because I was debilitated with anxiety for almost 30 years and really disabled from it. I mean, not from the physical, like we talked about with the rheumatoid arthritis, but it just ruled my life in a really negative way for 30 years from the time I was 12 till I was about 42. I had two nervous breakdowns in that process. And, I learned a lot coming out the other side. And when I ended up putting myself back through school and getting trained in trauma, a lot of dots connected that had never connected before. So I've taken everything I've learned both from my lived experience and then all the science of parts work and polyvagal theory and neuroscience and what's going on in the brain to bring a new perspective to people about what anxiety actually really is and how to have a different relationship with it. So part 1 will be what I learned from my own lived experience. And part 2 is more of that theory and that neuroscience and the polyvagal theory in the back end to give people a different lens through which to see this part of themselves.
Wonderful. That
Yeah.
sounds very exciting.
It is exciting. It's
That
been
sounds
quite the heavy
great.
lift.
Yes. And then the name of your podcast, people will be finding you because you're going to post it there, and people on my blog will get to find you there. And we'll put the transcript available, make that available as well.
Yes. So my podcast is Flip Your Mindset. It's also the name of my website, Flip Your Mindset. So if anybody's curious about any of the things I've talked about, you can find lots of information on my website there. And of course, the COM code is going to be there as well. So
That's wonderful.
yeah,
Thank you
this has
so
been
much.
amazing. Thank you for
Yes.
letting me share my story because I'm normally on the interviewer end, and I don't normally share a lot of my own personal journey. So this has been really lovely.
Same for me. It's been really lovely to be able to have the therapist perspective, the work you've done, some of that past that you've got. Thank you so much, Stacey.
Thank you so much for having me.